Up next, we have a panel discussion chaired by Dr. Varkki Pallathucheril. We will hear about how cities can be planned and governed in ways that better support the needs of older persons, changing how cities are arranged and organized in terms of space, and how changing the criteria used helps monitor the effectiveness of cities. Dr. Varkki Pallathucheril is a professor and dean at the American University of Sharjah. He is also one of the directors of Yohans Vimukthy International. He is a graduate of the Indian Institute of Kharagpur and Ohio State University. He has worked as an associate professor at the University of Illinois for 15 years. For the last 12 years, he has been working at the American University of Sharjah, of which the previous 6 years he's worked as the Dean of the College of Architecture and Art and Design. Dr. Sandeep Agarwal is Professor and Director of School of Urban and Regional Planning at the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, University of Alberta. Dr. Saket Sarraf is an architect, planner, and has joined the CEPT community as the Director of Library Services. He is an avid library user and believes in the vitality of libraries in being the soul of research and education. Please welcome Dr. Varkki Pallathucheril, Dr. Sandeep Agarwal, and Dr. Saket Sarraf.
Thank you, Sneha. It's my pleasure to lead this panel. And I want to thank my fellow panelists for taking the time to join me in this half-hour discussion. One of the things that may not be clear in the introduction is the three of us share a common link to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We've three gone in very different paths. As you know, Sandeep is in Canada, Saket is in India, I'm in the United Arab Emirates, but we've kept our connections over the years. So to both of you, my thanks for joining me in this session. As Sneha very nicely put it, this panel is really interested in looking at how cities can be planned and governed. That's, as urban planners, that's our interest, and we want to do it in a way that supports older persons, right? And as Sneha pointed, there are really two parts to that question. One is, how can we change the way cities are organized and arranged, so spatially? And how can we look at cities, assess cities differently in a way that recognizes the needs of older persons, right? Why cities? Why should we talk about cities? Well, for an increasing proportion of the world's population, the cities are the stage on which we play out our lives, right? Note, we'll come back to it later, it's not everybody on this planet, but for an increasing proportion of the world's population. So cities play a significant role in the quality of our lives. Today's discussion is going to be structured around 4 points that you see on the screen. And these are points that we have taken from a report published by the Global Coalition on Aging in 2016. It was also produced by the McGraw-Hill Financial Global Institute. If you look it up online for more information, you'll find it there. And so we will use these 4 points to structure our discussion today. So my role is to ask the questions, and my panelists will do the hard work and provide answers. So let me start with you, Sandeep. So this question of, as you age, how can you continue engagement with the world around you, right? Whether it's in terms of work, continue to be educated, continue to engage in arts and cultural activities, and continue in terms of recreation, to continue to engage the world. So let me hand it off to you, Sandeep.
Thanks, Varkki, and great to see you. Hello, everyone from Toronto, Canada. I actually live in Edmonton, Alberta, but I'm just traveling to Toronto. It's back to your question, Varkki. The way I see the continuing education of older immigrants or older adults in variety of sectors of our lives, I sort of call that social inclusion. So just a quick stats about Canada. By 2030, 1/4 of the Canadian population will be 65 plus. So you can see that Canadian population aging very fast, especially if you compare it against Indian population. So this issue is front and center in Canada, and we have a fairly large pan-Canadian research looking at the factors that lead to social inclusion and exclusion. You talked about spatial perspective, Varkki, but I'm going to add 4 other perspectives: political, economic, social, and then obviously the geospatial that you mentioned. So very quickly about political, when we talk about political inclusion, big P dimension of political is about laws and policies and programs and voting and all of that. But I think it's a small P, which is in this political dimension, is more important. That is about the broader participation of older adults in civic society, knowledge acquisition, and facilitating engagement and such. Social is more to do with how to ensure that older adults have social relationship, friends, acquaintances, and things of that in nature. Economic is very important, especially in Canada. Many of the older Canadians, especially older immigrants, are engaged in precarious nature of employment and income, and that has effect on social isolation. And geospatial will get into that encompasses housing, transportation, accessibility to these aspects of space and place context. So I just stop at that, but I think I just wanted to sort of set the stage for the next set of discussions.
Right, so that's great, Sandeep. So what you're telling us is it's not enough to think of cities just as spatial entities, right? Things that are spread out in space, but they also have economic systems, they have social systems and political systems that will have an impact on things. So you're asking us to essentially broaden our view of the situation beyond of the challenge, broaden our view of the challenge beyond just the physical arrangement. Thanks. Saket, any response to what Sandeep just said? Or I want to add to it?
Yeah, I totally agree to what Sandeep said, that it's the larger, the 4 issues: the political, the economic, social, and then the geospatial. But what really ties all the 3 things, the political, economic, and social, is the geospatial location. And I think from a planner's perspective, it is the geospatial, the co-location, that actually makes or breaks the political, social, and economic inclusion of people in our cities. So yes, the larger umbrella is extremely important, and as this panel's theme is, it is what Sandeep is describing through housing and transportation, that other 3 inclusions are really affected.
So let me just add to that a little bit and actually pose you a question. So it seems to me that one of the issues in older persons feeling confident in engaging with the outside world, where in any of these areas, is a sense of safety and security, no? That they need to be safe, they need to be secure in reaching out. Now, we've heard so many stories about older persons being the subject of really terrible scam and attacks and things like that. So when they attempt to move out of, to reach out to the outer world, really sometimes they're taken advantage of, right? During the pandemic, we've had many examples of it. And both of you know, we did that work in East St. Louis. There were so many examples where we had elderly homeowners, unscrupulous contractors coming and telling them that they could fix their homes by taking only a small portion of the equity they own in their home and basically stripping the home of its equity, right? So when you talk about social and political, I think a key aspect of it is giving people the confidence, giving older people the confidence that they can step out reach out and engage in this broader world without being subject to these kinds of unscrupulous people. Any reactions to that? From maybe Sandeep will go with you first, and then Saket.
I think you put it quite nicely, Varkki. But again, that goes beyond just city. I think you're talking about larger, much systemic issues. But I think in today's world, what is important, the confidence will come from connections, and we now have other ways of connecting, not just physical, but digital connections. So if you look at today's older adults, older immigrants here in Canada, they are transnational in nature. You know, they have folks from all across the world to whom they are connected. But yes, I mean, what you're talking about, the scam and unscrupulous things that happen, it does still happen. But I think older adults are actually much more digitally savvy, in my humble opinion, than even other folks. So yeah, but again, I think we're moving beyond cities now. We're talking about it.
Yeah. Saket, any insights about that aspect of it?
No, the legal and increasingly the financial, as we are becoming more digital, you know, has become a big factor for safety of senior citizens in our cities. Right? But as Sandeep said, yes, these are larger structural issues which go much beyond.
Yeah, add to that.
Sure, Sandeep.
Because you mentioned safety, I think the issue of safety is much more, not so much external factors, but actually internal factors. And I'm actually leading to elder abuse. Elder abuse has become very, very common, and it's growing quite a bit in Canada as the population is aging. And it is much more severe among the immigration population here in Canada. So if you look at the stats, about 1/3 of senior victims, you know, who reported violence against them, were actually by their own family members, by the child, spouse, siblings, other family members, and so on. And the rate of family violence is much, much, much higher among senior females. So I think we need to keep that into account, that it's just not folks from outside, but actually there's a lot of pressure and unsafe environment internal to where they live and where they house themselves.
Great, thanks. So one of the things I want to make clear to our audience is that we have limited time. So we are scratching the surface, but I hope we scratch the surface enough that we can reveal some of the real complicated issues that underlie some of what may seem like a simple position, right? Saket, do you want to talk to us about transportation and infrastructure and how we plan, design, construct, and provide these transportation infrastructure systems actually could help support the older population?
Yeah, thanks, Varkki. Transportation, I think, is, in my opinion, the single most determinant which contributes to independence, empowerment, productivity, and social engagement of the elderly. Right? And lack of it directly leads to isolation and inactivity and exclusion. So I think this is, from a city's perspective, this is the single most important instrument that can play a major role. I would kind of just use a different term like mobility compared to transportation, because transportation is the act of moving someone or something, where mobility is kind of more enabling, more empowering, and the ability to move or be moved. Right? So from that perspective, I think mobility may be a better term for this discussion. And of course, again, like with other things, safety, comfort, reliability, and affordability are the key determinants for not only for the elderly, but for most of the people in the city. And this applies to the elderly population. In terms of components that affect mobility, right, without going into too much details, how we design our streets, the sidewalks, the provision of street furniture, resting places, texture of the sidewalks, road crossings, and how much the walking light is on for the duration. Two things like transit design, which are typically designed for a mythical, average male of the city, where all the public transit is designed. How do we kind of break that and make it more inclusive? And that is not only about design, but also about a destination. Where do the transits connect to, rather than just connecting to the converging in the CBD? Can the transit also connect to other places that are of interest to the elderly, right? And the transit infrastructure, the buses and the trains, how many steps, how high the steps are. Buses being low floor height buses with extra width and things like that. So there are a lot of things, nuanced things in the transit also include sensitizing the operators that when the elderly is boarding the bus, the stopping and the accelerating and waiting and things like that. So it's a very nuanced but a complex way to design transit, which allows everybody to kind of use it more effectively. Right? And this is all more technical, but I think an important part that we sometimes overlook is also the community support. So it's not only the physical infrastructure of mobility or transit, but how others are sensitized in the community to support and to respect when a elderly person is using the transit, right? In terms of priority, respect, giving seats, and so on, taking care of them. Other infrastructure includes like buildings and public spaces, and again the issues of safety and accessibility, other things come in. And of course, there are many other infrastructure things in the city, like the electric grid or the economic infrastructure, or the communication and the digital infrastructure that is legible and not very complex and simple, right? And the civic infrastructure. So there are many other things which makes a lot of difference. I'll stop here.
Great, yeah, thanks. So essentially, so you talked about mobility, but we could also talk about accessibility. We talk about that as urban planners, right? It's being able to access the different things that you want. May not be necessarily by moving, right? But you are able to get to it. However, the point I think you're making is that for the elderly, it may not just be accessibility. It's not enough to sit at home and access things. The actual ability to move outside one's home, right? That I think is an important part of a sense of independence. Things like that. Sandeep, any responses to what Saket has just said?
Yeah, the only other thing that I would add to it is about understanding the travel behaviors of older adults, elderly people. Their needs, where they go, may be very different from other folks. Most likely, they're not going to a place of employment, but they may be going to other places. So just very quickly, I was involved in a study here in Toronto area when I lived here. So we had, the place called Brampton, which is just outside of Toronto, and a lot of immigrants who have come and reside in that city. And so we did a small study to see where exactly these older immigrants move around, where do they go. And what we found was that most of these folks, they actually, as their kids have left, their grandkids are at home, if they are much younger, then these older immigrants will take them to a nearest child care place. And from there, they were walking about 2 kilometers further up to a place of worship, a gurdwara or a temple or what have you. They will stay there because that's the place where they all come together. It's a place for, socialize and things of that in nature. Then they would walk to a 2.5 kilometer back to their childcare, pick up the kid, and then walk to their home. But there was no public transit. So we pushed the city of Brampton to actually do a pilot study of their own based on our study and do a pilot run of a bus, which they did. And it became very successful. The issue there was, what's the cost and benefit? And they figured out, well, that city, the benefit to these folks, these older immigrants, plus city was making money because, hey, there was enough ridership in that route. So I think those are the kinds of things that need to happen more often to understand that, hey, it's possible that, how they move, where they move, type of mobility, and all of that may be very different from the, let's say, rest of the population.
I would just add to that,
sure, Saket.
Many of these things are not necessarily very complex or expensive either. So my mom has stopped going to malls because there are not enough seats there to kind of take rest. Right? Many people would not go out because there's lack of clean public toilet, right? And that kind of reduces the time that somebody is actually out of the house, right? So many of these things are really simple things, which is more about actually understanding the barriers of why people move or don't move, and small things that anyway should happen for everybody, right? So I think it's also a big deal about just sensitizing people and saying, okay, these are low cost, no cost things that can make a big difference.
That's a great point. Thanks, Saket. So now, Sandeep, you've done a lot of work, and you've referred to it about looking at immigrant enclaves throughout Canada and issues around them. So why don't you talk us through housing, which is obviously the key factor in our existence, right? Shelter is key. So housing, and they talk about housing that enables aging in place. So maybe you can explain what aging in place means, and then any thoughts you have about how housing can provide more support for the older persons.
So housing is one of the key factors we found in terms of social inclusion and other forms of inclusion of older adults here in Canada. And we talk about age-friendly communities where the services, structures, and housing are such that they're designed to ensure that the aging in place take place. Well, you mentioned about enclaves in Canada. I would argue, in our studies, we have argued that enclaves provide space where aging in place can take place, because we have seen that in such neighborhoods, multiple generations of immigrants live together. There's enough amenities, infrastructure, friends, acquaintances, ethnic amenities of different sorts are all in the same place. So there are a lot of benefits of such neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods, especially for older adults and women and children. Now there is a threshold, and we can go into details of that, but there is a threshold of how many ethnics we are talking about, because it is possible that there will be so many of these ethnics living in an ethnic neighborhood that they're isolating themselves from the rest of the society, which is again not good for anybody, including older adults. So I'll just stop at that, just looking at the time.
The last point, Sandeep, is really important, because when we talked about continuing engagement, reaching out, right, this excessive clustering of people could actually act against that continuing engagement, right? So Saket, any from India, from your point of view, any comments about housing and aging in place, the challenges that it poses?
Historically, aging in place was happening a lot. Over last decade or so, things are changing very fast. And so I think it becomes even more important in the Indian context to have more integrated living option, more by design rather than by default, which was an option about a decade ago, right? And so how can we make our housing more inclusive rather than having the older adults move to senior only housing, which seems to be becoming a fad of some sort. I don't really know the reason. Second thing is, again, I'm looking at really low cost, no cost options. It's the option to accommodate changing needs of the senior adults in the housing. And so if I want to get my apartment kind of elderly ready, it's very little I can get as an off-the-shelf service that I call somebody to say, okay, make the staircase more accessible, or the toilet with all the safety features, or just making the balcony safer, right? And therefore there's a big market and a big scope for these small changes that can be done to existing units as a retrofit measure, but which can be done in a more intelligent, more scientific manner, and which is also reliable and again dependable, right? Borrowing from your example of St. Louis, that there's always a chance that people feel that they don't know what they're getting into. So making this provision also kind of greatly helps in aging in place, which may delay people moving out to more isolated location. Second thing I would want to add to that is from the climate resilience perspective, and heat waves have been kind of hitting us across continents, right? Canada, US, France, India is no exception. And so how can we, in the housing itself, how can we make sure that the units remain thermally comfortable, especially when the grid itself is under so much pressure, right? Because the elderly would be the first one to face the burn.
That's a great point, Saket, and I hope everybody captures that. So climate change is actually going to impact the elderly within their housing, because as we know, the elderly are particularly susceptible, vulnerable to temperature changes and things like that, right? And so that's a great point. Thank you. Saket, you want to talk briefly about community health? Because we're maybe running out of time, but we're worried about this. Community health?
So very, very quickly, in the interest of time, I think the aim of community health should be kind of, again, wide, banking on what Sandeep said, that we always need to kind of look at a broader picture. So it's not only about promoting, maintaining, or restoring health, but it's also about emotional and mental well-being. And I think, especially in the elderly community, that is extremely important. Though a lot of infrastructure is often focused on the physical health, the mental health, which is very much neglected, and it goes undiagnosed also. So in community health, I think we should flag that part. And of course, emergency services, access to emergency services, and COVID was a kind of a big eye-opener, right? That how do we get emergency services for the elderly particularly. So again, all of this ties to transportation and housing and location, accessibility, affordability. And there's a lot of scope for innovation in this domain to not go to get the health services, but how can some of these services reach you, right? And with all digitalization of health, that is another big opportunity to start with.
Yeah, so we had a previous session, my brother Chaco, that talked about the digitalization and its impact. Sandeep, anything to follow up on Saket?
Sure, and I will get into some of my work on human rights and make that connection as well, if that's okay, Varkki.
Sure.
So picking up on Saket's point about equitable access to transportation, to housing, health programs, and clinics, and so on and so forth. And that's where human rights law come into picture, where I sit, especially. So I'll make just a few points. One is that one of the serious issues in the Indian context is that ageism and older adults being discriminated to have access to all of these facilities, infrastructure that we talked about, that it's missing from the Indian Constitution. So essentially, ageism as a discriminatory factor is missing. And Universal Declaration of Human Rights is silent on discrimination by age as well. But I just wanted to say a little bit, but in practice in India, if you see, there are some programs, for instance, in trains, older adults get, reduced tickets of lesser value or what have you. There may be some other welfare schemes to protect older adults. But I wanted to just say about Canada, because some of the work that we did had a direct impact. So Canada's constitution does guarantee equality and prohibits discrimination based on age. It's in the section 15. But there are multiple levels of how human rights function and employed in the Canadian system. So you have the constitution, then you have at the provincial level, there are human rights acts. So where I live in Alberta, age was not a discriminatory factor. And there was lots of issues around housing. There were housing which were only, like adults only residential buildings. There were age restrictions on condominiums and cooperative housing and so on and so forth. And as of 2017, because of some of our work, it became illegal. So you could just see how much of law has to do with this. Back to the Constitution, there were a number of cases in early 90s which have an effect on what has happened in Canada. In Canada, since 2005, there is no mandatory retirement. Mm-hmm. So you can continue. So I think these are some of the good things and progress that have been made in the Canadian context because of how the law was changed and how the guarantees are now instituted as part of the Constitution and various provincial human rights acts.
Right. Look, I'm sorry we've run out of time, it seems. My apologies. One key idea to leave you with: cities are not everything. We still have a significant population that lives in rural areas, and for whom this would actually be a greater challenge than in cities. So that's something to keep in mind, and particularly in the context of India, right? Thank you both for joining me in this. We will probably continue chatting about this in the future. One last point. I think we need a system of auditing cities. We need to be able to go in and look at cities and say, these are the criteria we will look at cities, and how is the city functioning in terms of its ability to support older people. I promise that's my last point, and we'll stop with that. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening to us.
Thank you.